As you might imagine, the sort of continual push to expand this campaign for freedom, as some historians have put it, will have a backlash in the United States. Remember, going back to the 1950s, we had seen an increase in religious interest and religious fervor in the midst of the Cold War. We'd also seen a very tightly controlled sort of social structure and a tightly controlled culture that rock and roll threatened. And even in the 50s, you could begin to see some backlash as you have groups like the Beatniks emerging, people like Jack Kerouac, for instance. But it's in the 1970s, I think, that you really see the battle lines drawn of this larger culture war that will come to so shape American politics in the latter 20th century. There are numerous examples of conservative reaction, and I'll just mention a few, but one of the key figures and one of the best known figures is Phyllis Schlafly. She was a Republican organizer and, in fact, a working wife who, in the early 1970s, when the Equal Rights Amendment was brought out to the states for ratification, began to organize to combat and, in fact, to stop the final ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Her key issue, and she also publishes a book, but her key issue is that the Equal Rights Amendment and what's happening with women's rights threatens the fundamentals of the family and thus of American society. 1977, in terms of gay rights, 1977, singer Anita Bryant will begin a campaign against a Miami law that banned discrimination against homosexuals. She begins or starts an organization called Save Our Children, again tying her efforts to saving the family, and makes a number of statements. And I'll just throw one out here. One of the quotes that's associated with Anita Bryant is that basically, if God would have wanted gays to have rights, then, quote, God would have created Adam and Bruce rather than Adam and Eve. The quote there, again, ties these issues and the confrontation of this push for freedom back to religion. And it turns out that the emergence of a sort of politicized religion in the United States, a political force tied to religion in the United States, will be one of the key characteristics of the reaction of the 1970s. And here's what I mean by that. The 1970s saw a newly energized and newly political evangelistic or evangelical fundamentalist sort of crusade. Now, last time we really talked about fundamentalism, of course, was the Scopes trial, and we talked about in the 1920s. We were talking about evolution. There are a number of ideas that carry over here, a number of concepts that evangelicals hold to and that fundamentalists continue to hold to, that there are certain standards for biblically moral behavior, that the scriptures, the Judeo-Christian scriptures, are literally inerrant or without error, and that Christians, in particular, have a responsibility to evangelize, to spread the good news and the gospel. There was also a real emphasis among the evangelical community on this notion of being born again, or the idea that in coming to Christianity, one's behavior will reflect a fundamental change spiritually, in the soul, in the heart. The unique thing about this, though, in the 1970s and into the 1980s, again, was the political nature, that these Christians sort of woke up and said to themselves, we are a large contingent of the American population. Changes are occurring, and they're occurring in part because of politics in the United States. We can have an impact on these changes through politics. And so we see the emergence of a right to life movement as a direct relation or reaction to the Roe v. Wade decision. Another issue that will emerge of considerable importance in the 1970s for evangelicals will be the issue of prayer in schools, which the Supreme Court had determined could not be a product of authority figures in the schools and could be limited. That goes back to the traditional question asked back in the 1920s over the tie of religion and religious belief to education. The two things will often be tied together. The leaders of this evangelical movement of the 1970s would use media very effectively to get their message out and to build political organization. One of the key figures involved was Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell, who was pastor of the Thomas Road Baptist Church in Virginia, would form a group known as the Moral Majority. And the Moral Majority would have a huge impact in 1980 in the election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency. Another major figure, and there are several, but another major figure also turns out from Virginia is Pat Robertson, who would himself run for president of the United States. He developed his own Christian broadcasting network, would develop a university, much as Falwell would, but also became intimately involved in the Christian Coalition, which was, again, an organization to effect political change. I don't want to leave anybody out. There were Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, Oral Roberts, Jimmy Swaggart, lots and lots of sort of television evangelists emerging in the 1970s on a national level, not just local or regional, but national. But I don't merely wish to leave it with those evangelists, because if I do, I'm afraid you come away with this sense of caricature. I think we have to understand that much of the support for the conservative revolution in American politics in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, and it still continues to have an effect, much of that support would come from suburbia. Working class, but middle class in particular support. And it was there where I think you could argue it's not so much the Pat Robertsons or the Jerry Falwells who are behind this sort of reaction to what they consider threats to traditional American values. But it's in many ways at the grassroots, as you see organization in places like Orange County, California, to back conservative candidates like Ronald Reagan. We also see in the 1970s really quite massive growth in any number of denominations that tend to be more evangelical. Among them, the Southern Baptist Association experienced tremendous growth in the 70s and 80s, in particular the Assemblies of God. And we see, and I think this is also very telling, we see beginning in the 1970s the birth of the suburban megachurch. One of the sort of major stars of this sort of televised evangelism today is Joel Osteen, who actually has services in an arena. I mean, it's massive numbers of people, but that's just a sort of image of what's going on across suburbia, across America, where you have these large Protestant churches of multiple thousands of people. It's all rather tied together. Religion is tied into education, is tied into culture. And you have then, in terms of reaction to what some would certainly see as this push for freedom, you have a reaction, and that creates that cultural tension, and it's continued to play a huge role in American politics ever since.